that should make it a lot easier for you and for me. I won't repeat anything that I said because it wasn't very interesting. But I'm going to read one or two of the sections, which I think is where a contribution, which I don't expect others to touch on, is going to be made. So the recent research by Tim Bale and others has shown that the economic preferences of those voters who switched their electoral support from Labour in 2015 to the Conservatives in 2017 are well to the left of Conservative MPs, that their economic preferences. But their social and cultural preferences are well to the right of them. These switchers are even, on average, to the right of members of the Conservative Party, so they're much further to the right. Now, I think that's the electoral situation that the Conservative Party now faces in regard to holding on to its new red wall constituencies, which means working class broadly in the north of England and the Midlands. But it also needs to hold on to those constituencies which are or have historically been Conservative, Liberal Democrat marginals in the south of England, where economic preferences are much more centrist and cultural preferences are also much more liberal. So that's the situation that the Conservative Party faces. This is the reality, if you like, of working class post-liberalism, not liberal on economics and also not socially liberal. So the immediate challenge for the Conservative Party is to sustain support in both of those constituencies. Now, what red wall voters want may then seem irreconcilable with the basic principles of the modern Conservative Party, because they want interventionism in economics, but they want conservatism on social and cultural issues. I disagree that this is irreconcilable. The Conservative Party has been at its most successful when it has recognised itself as a coalition, a concordia discourse, and when personnel on one side of that coalition have recognised the benefit of lending the initiative to the other side for some specific purpose. It has, of course, long been recognised that the Conservative Party is not uniform doctrinally. At any given time, it has had within its ranks Whigs, Tories, protectionists and free marketeers, national liberals, traditionalists, modernisers, individualists, collectivists, Eurosceptics and Europhiles, unionists, the English sort of civilizationists, if you like, and so on. Factions or traditions with differing emphases. And we should never overlook what my colleague Philip Norton has called the pragmatic middle, which usually holds the balance of power within the parliamentary party. But beneath all this contingent variety, I think, there have always been two elemental forces operating in British Conservative thought, practice and rhetoric. I've taken my title here from the title of a book by John Gray in 2000 called The Two Faces of Liberalism. That was published in the context of the multiculturalism debate. Its value is its straightforward elucidation of the basic conceptual contradiction of liberalism, which perhaps corresponds with the dilemmas that liberals have recently faced, especially around sex education in Muslim schools, cultural cancellation, and the limited free speech of those skeptical about gender identity theory and things like that. Now, for John Gray, liberalism seeks both the peaceful coexistence of people who are pursuing different ideals, goods and values in different ways of life. The search for the state as a modus vivendi is his term, a way of living, and the search for a rational consensus on the best way of life, the ideal form of life for all mankind. And these are in contradiction, he argues. In fact, he says that, that following Hobbes, Hume, Mill, Isaiah Berlin and Michael Oakeshott, liberals need to return to this tradition of simply prioritising the coexistence of people with different values, different fundamental ideas about the good life. So he says if the liberal project is to be renewed, the ambiguity that has haunted it from its origins must be resolved. The idea of toleration as a means to a universal consensus on values must be given up, he says, with the adoption instead of a project of modus vivendi among ways of life animated by permanently divergent values. Now, although conservatism, I think, also has two faces, conservatives don't face exactly that same dilemma because they've always agreed that the rationalistic search for a consensus on the ideal way of life is folly. Conservatives already reject the liberal Enlightenment fundamentalism of positivism, and they already prize the empirical peaceful settlement that has been established between persons and groups that were once in conflict, and the prudent maintenance of that settlement. So on these various points, Conservatives might feel a certain schadenfreude as liberals tear themselves apart over doctrines which are rendered false by conceptual fundamentalism. But there is a formal identity, I think, between the two faces of liberalism and conservatism at a higher level of abstraction. And although Gray doesn't know it, he's really only narrating how the liberal tradition has refracted Michael Oakeshott's deeper dialectic of what he calls in this wonderful book, the politics of faith and the politics of skepticism. Everybody knows about rationalism in politics and on human conduct, but this book, this essay, is neglected. It was written in the 50s. He chose not to publish it. We didn't discover it until he died in 1990 among his papers. Bizarre. He probably thought that on human conduct replaced it. I don't think it does. The basic instinct of what he calls the politics of skepticism is to reduce the severity of conflict through adjustments to the system of rights, duties, and means of redress, but not to spend any more of the community's resources on this than is necessary. Government must therefore be strong enough to do that job, but government is not omnicompetent in the skeptical point of view, and it does not govern minutely. It doesn't get involved in the small details of people's ways of life. Improvement in the skeptical mode only means successful adjustments that lessen the severity of conflict. The political skeptic holds either that we do not know enough about eudaimonia, the good life, for governments to try to encourage it, the knowledge constraint, as Ferenc Hörcher calls it in his book, The Political Philosophy of Conservatism, which I think gives them a much deeper history of the idea of prudence and something like what Oakeshott means by skepticism than Oakeshott provides. So I think Ferenc Hörcher has provided way more than Oakeshott on this. I've said that the skeptic in politics is an instinct, but of course skepticism has also been worked up into conscious political theories of limited government and prudence, the folly of perfectionism, and the dangers of rushing into decisions, as well as of interfering where you can do more harm than good. But there's another pole of politics for Oakeshott, and the important thing is that political language, political terminology is always ambiguous because it has both a skeptical mode, a meaning for the political skeptic, but it also has a meaning in the mode of what he calls the politics of faith. Now, as Oakeshott describes it, the politics of faith means the belief that man can be improved and perfected by his own efforts, chiefly through the perfection of his circumstances by government. Government is not merely an auxiliary agent of this pursuit, it is the chief inspirer and sole director of it. If faith here stands for a kind of religion, it is one founded upon the Pelagian heresy. We can recognize faith easily enough in the modernist totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, whether in its communist or nationalist versions, but also Oakeshott thinks in the gradualist socialism of post-war Western states. Oakeshott would refine his diagnosis in his political masterpiece on human conduct. The essence of the politics of faith is now what he calls enterprise association. The state is understood not merely as a civil association that merely maintains the conditions of peaceful coexistence, but as a society that takes over, in Oakeshott's analysis from the medieval church, the achievement of a final goal for all man, of something like spiritual improvement, the building of the New Jerusalem. Accordingly, on this view, governments exist in order to realize eudaimonia. Now, Oakeshott explains that although the politics of skepticism and the politics of faith seem like incompatible programs, and to a liberal philosopher like Gray they are incompatible, they are better thought of as the abstract principles that are always incompletely realized, the ideal extreme poles between which the practical activity of governing always fluctuates and which gives politics its practically mixed and ambiguous character, both the prudent keeping of the king's peace and apparently trying to improve the subjects, those two instincts, if you like, in Concordia discourse. Now, just skipping a bit here, it may be that there is still too much faith in British politics and not enough skepticism, as Oakeshott thought, and that's sort of my instinct as well. However, I think the post-liberal climate demands more politics of faith, more enterprise association in the state, in government, not less. Liberal elites, say post-liberal theorists, have been too sceptical about government intervention in markets, too sceptical about intervening in the power relations of the workplace, and too sceptical about defending traditional Western beliefs about personal conduct and morality. Modus vivendi for post-liberal theorists has worked for the middle class and for immigrant enclaves, but not for the native working class. Since the statist turn of the Liberal Party in the late 19th century, the politics of faith in Britain has been mostly understood through its egalitarian version. The correct political faith today is that government should engineer equality and should do so directly by its own actions upon individuals and communities. The measure of progress in this way of thinking is the extent to which equality is achieved. That is why progressive taxation is that which punishes the rich and powerful for being so heretically unequal. The Conservative Party has, of course, agreed terms with the egalitarian faith, which is why it now finds itself facing the embarrassingly practical question of what levelling up actually looks like when it comes down from heaven. To some of us, the Conservatives' accommodation of the politics of faith may sound like an abandonment of its sceptical tradition and too much like appeasing socialism. But first, the Conservative Party is still the best bet for voters and donors who lead towards Whiggish scepticism about government ambitions and who prefer mere stability and the prudent tactics of the limited style of politics. And we know that there is still significant scepticism of a sort in Britain, or at least in England, among many both middle class and working class voters. Scepticism towards, for example, governments that try to spend their way out of their largest ever budget deficit, that punish their own taxpayers for China's carbon emissions, that believe more school leavers should go to university. On such questions, the other major parties are tied to the egalitarian version of the politics of faith, which obliges them to pursue social engineering, environmentalism, and more interference with business rather than less. It's therefore vital for the future of the Conservative Party that it maintain its sceptical tradition, its position as the most limited and prudent of the UK's credible parties, and show its sceptical face to the relevant target voters and donors. For these voters, the party must appear the most prudent party of government, the most competent, the least idealistic, when the national debt as a percentage of GDP is so high. I've so far discussed two authors, Gray and Oakeshott, who advocate more scepticism and made a case for defending that faith. So it might strike you as a volte-face if I say now that I think the immediate future of conservatism in Britain, precisely because of the post-liberal climate, is to be found in less scepticism and more faith. There is, you see, also a distinctly Tory version of political faith, which has been eclipsed in recent decades. We don't recognise it as such because it is anti-rationalistic, inegalitarian, and anti-modernist. And because in practice it is always significantly compromised, it is always significantly compromised by the conservative tendency to scepticism. But it is activist and Pelagian all the same, and it does posit a common good. Therefore, when Conservatives believe themselves to have improved the state of England rather than only to have maintained it, it is improvement towards the following extreme. So this is what I'm claiming is the Tory version of political faith. The politics of faith in its Tory version that I have in mind here makes a number of assertions. First, that government should not be neutral on the question of what it is to live well, as classical liberals attempted to be. Government should prescribe particular practices and standards. Second, that these are the same practices and standards that comprise a successful human life. So far, these features are held in common with the egalitarian faith that I've said is hegemonic today. But in addition to this, the Tory faith holds, third, that what we need for living our best lives are not rationalistic, enlightened morals to then be reflected in novel institutions, but the old institutional order, the ancient constitution that we have in the past realized less imperfectly than we have today. Political institutions, private institutions, and the intermediary civic associations of civil society, along with the historic virtues and standards of conduct upon which their success depends. These institutions, practices, and standards are authoritative success criteria for good living, for eudaimonia, and they are the common good. The institutional order is sacred, and we owe it our loyalty in the Tory version of faith. But fourth, the personal advancement that our institutions and standards foster will never be realized equally. Although the institutional order and its standards are therefore to be asserted and defended unapologetically as common to all citizens will not participate or thrive in it uniformly. There should be different routes through it. Some people, sometimes many people, will fail or find a level lower than they think they deserve. This is not skeptical realism. It is the positive belief that there are natural differences between people and that the institutional order should facilitate the meritocratic ranking of those differences in their outward manifestations. Fifth, some will resent and reject the entire system, but this does not delegitimize our institutions or the civil order of our nation as a whole. There have always been anti-political people, and this is in fact how they find their correct place at the bottom of the order. And sixth, that government is, because it's a politics of faith, government is the creator and protector of this institutional order and its practices and standards against popular disruption, and government will therefore be the chief agent of restoration when those institutions and that order has been degraded by opponents. The Tory faith, I think, is what animated Victorian interest in reviving something of England's feudal order. It is prescriptive, traditionalistic, a little nationalistic, and inegalitarian. It is liberal in the sense that it prizes liberties for individuals, but illiberal in that it rejects libertinism in favour of the dutiful restraint effected by established institutions and Christian morality. It's also recognisable in many of the groups whose fortunes Kevin Hickson has traced in Britain's conservative right since 1945. For many members of the Conservative Party in Parliament, in the press, and almost all of what remains of it in British university, conservatism is simply fiscal conservatism. On social and cultural questions, most elite conservatives conform to what Philip Blond has called mass bohemianism. Their fundamental presuppositions about human conduct, then, are sceptical. But it's a mistake to think that the Tory faith is not popular with working class voters. And indeed, there's interesting work done by an American psychologist called Jonathan Haidt on moral foundations, and he finds that conservatives appeal to 6 moral foundations, whereas liberals really base it only on 2. And this is why conservative parties are able to draw upon a wider spread of the population than liberals can really understand, because they care about, as well as care and liberty, they also care about loyalty, authority, and sanctity, and conversely, betrayal, subversion, and degradation. Now, I'm just going to say a little about what this means as an ideological resource for the Tory faith, and how this can shape and justify the economic interventionism that red wall conservatives now expect, even though the skeptic in me also believes that it probably won't work, that it presently isn't affordable, and that even if it began to work, the left and a critical mass of working class voters would find some reason to cry about it. The chief difference is that this kind of activist Toryism restores the condition of the nation's established institutions through and in which its members advance themselves. Working class people know which institutions are old and real, which foster their personal advancement and benefit society, but are now always struggling, and which institutions are fake and dysfunctional. And I say fake in the technical sense in which Scruton wonderfully, I think, explains it. And these institutions only seem to rip them off and undermine society, but they always seem to be growing. Among the real institutions, we find traditional education, including in grammar schools, church schools, and private schools, which should transmit, along with other things, knowledge of our history, our literature, our common myths, as well as obedience to authority and autonomy. We find also in these real institutions apprenticeship, the technical college, the small or medium-sized business, firm, or company, the prison, which dispenses criminal justice that is actually retributive, the non-intensive farm, the trade union, the working class marriage and household, the town council, its local shops, post office, church and library, and the huge range of autonomous local associations, all of which are reliant in some way on people having expendable time and money to give. Philip can talk more about that if he wants to, because a lot of his book is about how to restore this lost civic middle. Conversely, among the fake and dysfunctional institutions that undermine working class advancement, we find schools based on comprehensive dogma and wacky progressive theories, and the systematized assumption that teachers are not trustworthy or professional, welfare dependency, self-serving government agencies, a good deal of the university programs that seduce working class applicants, the fake regimes of domestic discipline monopolized by social services, and a form of criminal punishment that, as my father-in-law delicately puts it, sees Jihadi John taken for a weekend of kayaking in Wales. The Tory faith holds, and this is my final comment, that the former institutions can work, the real established old ones that advance them, so long as they're maintained. Whereas the latter, because they are incompetent and fake, as well as expensive, should be dissolved or assimilated into the real institutions. Exactly how you do that is not for me to say, others are more competent here. But I think an ethos of restoring real institutions that provide a context for working class people to advance themselves meritocratically, which are not closed ranks of a kind of managerial elite, is the broad activist Tory position.
Thank you, Chris. And now let me introduce the second speaker of this panel, Kit Covell. He is a historian of modern British politics. He received his DPhil in politics from the University of Oxford in 2014, before going on to hold research and teaching positions at Teesside University, Oxford, and King's College London. He is currently a research fellow at KCL, where he is leading a project on the history of letter writing to politicians in Britain. His monograph on British conservatism and the Second World War is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. And today he is going to give a long titled talk. The arteries of our party are stiffening as the result of the infusion of blood that is foreign to the true nature of conservatism. That was a quote. Conservatives against liberalism and lessons from the Second World War. Kit, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Here we go. I went for a slightly shorter title in the end, thanks. So, I mean, as the conference already and the kind of interactions we've all had in the last few days are proving, it's a very exciting time to be a conservative with an interest in challenging liberalism. And what I'd like to do today, though, is to look back to what I think was arguably the last time when there was a real, similarly self-confident radical challenge to liberalism, which within the Conservative Party during the Second World War, when this man, Viscount Hinchingbrook, of the Tory Reform Committee, in this case speaking to the students at Oxford University, talked about the way the arteries of the party were stiffening and how it was necessary for conservatives to embrace progression rather than progress. Now, the fact that I'm talking about this intellectual renaissance as coming during the Second World War might be something of a surprise. The Second World War in Britain is usually understood as a time of triumph for the left and for the liberalism, when the doctrine of this man, William Beveridge and Maynard Keynes were all conquering, and when Labour rode to power on the back of them, with conservatives supposedly too preoccupied with the business of winning the war to think too much about politics. Now, in my forthcoming book, Blue Jerusalem, I show how wrong I think this story of World War II is, and how, in fact, it was often conservatives who came up with the boldest and most radical plans for the future and made decisions about how, where, and with whom to fight that were much more politically consequential than what particular type of health service Britain ended up with. In short, I want to argue how the Second World War was the Tories' war as much as the People's War. Today, though, I am going to focus on just one group of conservatives and their wartime challenge to liberal ideas about the economy, about the state, and about society. The group of self-styled Tory progressives, as they like to call themselves, who orbited around this man, R.A. Butler, or Rab Butler, as he was known almost universally. Now, again, talking about someone as a radical conservative and mentioning Rab Butler might come as a bit of a surprise. Rab, as we've seen, is often portrayed as the arch consensus politician, one half of the post-war Mr. Buttskill. During the war, though, nothing could really be further from the truth. An arch appeaser, Butler began the war as Under-Secretary of State for the Foreign Affairs, and as Andrew Roberts has shown, along with his chum Arthur Bryant, was engaged in attempts to secure a negotiated peace with Germany well after that was not a wise thing to do. It wasn't, though, just international politics that Butler was interested in. In January 1940, Butler, with party funding and direct backing from Neville Chamberlain, set up a little-known group called the Central Committee for National Policy. And this was designed to show that Conservatives were at the forefront of the various conversations about post-war reconstruction that were going on. They wanted to work to coordinate the actions of sympathetic groups and to prepare a programme for what Butler called a New England. The group's aim was to work both inside and outside the Conservative Party to do what, in Butler's words, came out as elevating the value of political life and attacking the materialism which was so much a feature of 19th century thought. During the spring of 1940, Butler spent his time recruiting some of the most interesting policy entrepreneurs, as we probably call them today, businessmen and political thinkers who were around. Many of them would go on to play a key role in wartime and post-war politics. Among them were people like Max Nicholson, the pioneering environmentalist and head of the progressive think tank, Political and Economic Planning, Oliver Franks, a moral philosopher and future ambassador to the USA, and Lord Weir, the Scottish industrialist who chaired the Wartime Industrial and Export Council, which is probably the most complete expression and an example of functionalist corporatism in Britain that you've never heard of. Perhaps, though, the most impressive and for where we are today, appropriate person involved with all of this was the Hungarian-born sociologist Karl Mannheim, whose summer, as he called it, stressed the ontological precedence of society over the individual, and who called for a democratically planned political system that would recognize and embody this fact. And on May the 29th, 1940, during the midst of the evacuation from Dunkirk, Butler and Mannheim came together at a meeting where their views described by the secretary of the CCMP as being in complete accord. The result was this, a draft manifesto that reveals just how radical at this stage the proposals were for a New England. It was presented, as the quote shows, as a mean to combine a new authoritarian element with our ancient liberty. And it included plans like treating unemployment as a sin, controlling all skilled and agricultural labor, regulating capital investment and the rate of profit via long-range economic planning. And it also emphasized the need to develop a new way of life based on discipline and to restrict the work of Parliament to issues of life and death, with a new functional corporatist body there to oversee all economic matters. Now, over the course of the summer of 1940, when invasion threatened and when a revolutionary moment in Britain seemed possible to some, the CCMP and its members worked to flesh out these ideas, sometimes actually embracing the language of totalitarianism in their discussions. Now, central to all of these was their focus on a new set of economic rights that citizens would receive in return for greater obligations. And here they were very much inspired by the way in which conscription had been very easily introduced in Britain during the Second World War, in contrast to the First. So they came up with ideas, borrowing from the Turkish, for example, that in return for receiving your education, you'd give 2 years of work to the state, or the idea that people could be free to choose their occupation, but the state would tell them which part of the country that they would practice it in. However, by the late summer of 1940, the political environment in Britain had changed. As the threat of invasion receded, so did the appetite for reforms designed to preempt a revolution. with with Chamberlain ailing and Churchill able to exercise more control, the CCMP was effectively wound up by the Central Party. Undeterred, though, most members of the CCMP kept on working, this time with a focus on religion, on education, and on the young. And in many ways, this had always been the plan. The need for a specific and forceful appeal to youth had been central to Butler's original conversations with Mannheim. And it also went to the very heart of the political and intellectual problems that the group around Butler was trying to solve. How to reconcile the control, discipline, and unity of purpose that the totalitarian state supposedly exhibited and were deemed necessary to win the war without succumbing to their excesses. Penning an article in the Listener magazine titled "Establishing a Christian Civilization," Butler sketched out his ideas of how to do this, including things like teaching a simple code of Christian behavior and building a new Christian elite drawn from all levels of society. Building on these ideas, many of those associated with the CCMP and Butler went on to author a couple of reports in 1942. The Education Committee of it was called the Post-War Planning Central Committee of the National Union of the Conservative Party, so quite a mouthful. The Education Committee was chaired by Geoffrey Faber of Faber and Faber, who during the war was T.S. Eliot's roommate, and their first report was called Educational Aims. And it critiqued the emphasis on individual self-development that had previously dominated educational thinking. As it wrote, "It must be the primary duty of national education to develop a strong sense of national obligation in the individual citizen, to encourage in him an ardent understanding of the state's needs, and to render him capable of serving these needs." But then what were the national obligations? What were the state's needs? These, the report's authors suggested, while having always existed amongst a central core, had been more clearly revealed through the war. The state's central purpose was to maintain the nation itself, self-defense before all else. And to do this, the report argued that children needed to be taught not just how to use arms, but to be proud of their ancestors and their inheritance, and to accept the consequent responsibilities of a colonizing and missionary world power. Here, the nation to be defended was most definitely a historical and an imperial one. With the state presented as the expression of the national will, its perpetuation was deemed paramount. It was also why the report focused so intensely on religion. Surveying the international situation at the time, it argued that the recent history of France, Germany, and Russia indicated that no modern state could adopt an attitude of indifference to religion. In France, anti-clericalism and the absence of state support for religion was what they argued lay behind the country's spiritual and consequent military collapse. In Germany, National Socialism had managed to create itself into its own ersatz religion, while in Russia, powerful religious energies had been channeled into materialist communism. Here, religious energy was presented as the state's motive force, necessary for social action and looking beyond oneself. It was also the source of social discipline. It was the incubator of the virtues that the state needed for its survival: self-defense, courage, initiative, etc. As they went on in the report, they suggested the state did not, though, need to promote a particular dogma. In fact, to do so might actually endanger the state through sectarian struggle. But it did need to promote an emotional awakening among its citizens. I stress that again, an emotional awakening that would allow its citizens to lift their eyes above the everyday and towards the transcendental. This was why the report supported the funding of all religious schools, so long as they met certain standards, but also allowed children to be withdrawn from RE in schools as long as they were receiving religious instruction at home. Butler's emphasis on the creation of a new Christian elite, an idea he shared with T.S. Eliot noticeably, also reappeared in the report, with the authors stating that too much time had been spent thinking about raising the average moral and educational ability and not enough on the exceptional. And as such, the group argued that the exceptional child needed to be identified early, separated out educationally, but not socially, and allowed to specialize without losing, though, a broader appreciation of the context in which he or she was living. They then created a more practical report, which was called A Plan for Youth, which argued for a kind of compulsory registration of all young children over the age of 14 and creation of a kind of new federation. The idea here was to kind of educate children, particularly not just intellectually, but very much in body, health and fitness for the nation, but also character. And it was a body that was actually meant to work through existing voluntary organizations with the Scouts and the Air Training Corps models. So the idea was that the Federation was there to meet the pre-military needs of the services, but also to revive the sense of personal respect and social conscience that its authors suggested that interwar children rather lacked. Now, neither this report nor the educational report actually received a favourable reception from the Conservative Party. There was a suggestion that what was being argued for was barely disguised Christian fascism, and that the Federation of Youth bore remarkable similarity to the Hitler Youth. And there were similarly hostile reactions from trade unions and the voluntary sector. And as a result, Butler rather quietly dropped his support in association with the reports. Yet it would be wrong to think of this, I think, as the end of the story. Viscount Hinchinbrook and the Tory Reform Committee shared many of the same sentiments and prescriptions as Butler and his CCMP chums, though they shied away from the crisis analysis and emphasis on first principles that was key to what Butler was trying to get at. Most impressive, though, some of the policies that Butler and the CCMP advocated did, in some ways, come to be. There was no federation of youth, but the basic idea of a state-sponsored program of youth development will sound eerily familiar to some of us people who have from England who spent kind of windy weekends on a moor being guided on a Duke of Edinburgh exhibition. Likewise, the 1944 Education Act, which was steered through the Commons by Butler as president of the Board of Education, which then went on to set up Britain's post-war tripartite school system, in many ways did actually follow the model of state-sponsored religious education that had previously been outlined. Even the Act's prescription that a daily form of religious service be undertaken was a direct copy of what was outlined 2 years before, something that often gets forgotten about the Butler Act with its stress on it being a progressive measure. Indeed, even the idea of the state working to select out the best and brightest, to inculcate a set of Christian virtues within them and provide an opportunity for specialism, but within the context of a wider understanding, did eventually, well, perhaps arguably, bear fruit. Just think of our former grammar school girl Prime Minister. What lessons then might Conservatives, particularly those with a post-liberal bent, learn from the experience of Butler and the CCMP during the war? Obviously, in a post-colonial and increasingly secular society, there's no simple carryover of ideas and policy from Butler and the CCMP that we can make our own. Yet, if I was to put my political hat on, there are clearly some things that we can learn. First, the benefits of working with others, not least those from other side of the political spectrum. The danger of being associated, even if that association is unfair, with political enemies abroad. The need for a connected and politically attuned figure like Butler, who knew when to express first principles and also knew when to let policy do the talking. As well as, finally, the way in which long-term, what looks like short-term failure can actually turn out as a long-term success. But finally, and I think most importantly, the work of Butler and the CCMP should remind Conservatives that many of them who were then kind of considered to be very central figures in the party, actually used to worry very deeply about how to maintain the continuity of the state, how to engender loyalty towards it, and how to create an elite necessary to lead it. Questions as events all too close to here remind us are ones that we can't always dodge. Now, we may not be able to generate the emotional energy among the young that religion can so often provide. In fact, some of us may not want to. But in an education system that seems in many ways intent on judging success only in terms of a young person's material outcomes, where skills and knowledge are things to be acquired rather than enjoyed, I think the state would do well to remember that its survival is also a product of its citizens' experience of majesty and mystery, wherever they're to be found, whether that's the beauty of our natural world, the splendor of our fantastic built environment, or indeed simply the richness of studying history for its own sake. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit, for that. And let me introduce the final speaker of this session, Kevin Hickson, who is senior lecturer in British politics at the University of Liverpool. He has published 16 books and numerous articles in leading journals. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and spoken in the UK Parliament on several occasions and in Australia, France, and the USA. And today he is going to talk about the conservative right, past, present, and future. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Can I start by thanking Andrea and Ferenc and Philip, but in particular for me to Daniel, whose work I followed for some time, and I think he's got a very bright future ahead of him, was doing some very interesting stuff. And I'm pleased to follow on from two excellent papers as well. That's not to say that my paper is going to be excellent. I hope we don't let the quality down too much. But Dan asked me to speak in relation to my book, which came out a couple of years ago on Britain's conservative right since the end of the Second World War, which I did not because I feel myself part of that tradition, but that it's really received very little academic attention. And also Dan asked me to shape what I've said in that book in relation to this theme of post-liberalism. And as the opening speakers remarked, post-liberalism is a very difficult term in some ways, and it needs some unpicking, which is obviously what we're going to do today. And I'll try and make a few remarks in relation to that. So what I mean by what do we mean by the conservative right? Well, certainly since 1979, if not earlier, with Enoch Powell in the 1960s, the conservative right has been synonymous with free market economics. But one of the arguments that I want to make is that borrowing from liberalism, of economic liberalism, has actually been very damaging to a lot of the core values of the conservative right properly understood. More broadly, the Conservative right is very often dismissed as the awkward squad, the mavericks, the eccentrics, the troublemakers and the oddballs of the parliamentary Conservative Party and beyond. I mean, they would, I think, see themselves as the custodians of the authentic Conservative tradition, the point at which, if you like, conservatism with a big C, as in the thought and practice of the Conservative Party, overlaps with conservatism with a small c, borrowing from a wider conservative philosophical tradition. But equally, although they would see themselves as defenders of that true, authentic conservatism, as they would see it, they would see themselves very much on the margins of the Conservative Party. And it's easier, actually, I think, to define the Conservative right by what they're against. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because very often they're against, they took positions which are against their own party, whether in government or in opposition, consistently from 1945, because they regarded the Conservative Party as being too concerned with electoral pragmatism, too willing to make concessions, too willing to move away from the core of conservatism, as I said, as they would see it. So defenders of the authentic conservative tradition, but on the margins of the Conservative Party, as I think the way they would see themselves. That was certainly true in the period from 1945 to 79, but also, perhaps more surprisingly, in the period since 1979, or between 79 and 97, when the right of the party appeared to be, in the ascendant. So to go back to the sort of core values of the Conservative right as I've defined them in the book there, first of all, a pessimistic view of human nature based often, but not exclusively, on a Christian idea of original sin, and therefore a greater emphasis that we tend to place on social order rather than individual freedom, on the authority and sovereignty of the nation state, and a belief that inequality is natural and very often desirable. But there were within that various tensions, and I trace those in the book. First of all, over the empire, certainly in the post-1945 period, very much in the tradition of Joseph Chamberlain, the Conservative right were very much die-hard defenders of the empire. Really, until the 1960s, with Enoch Powell, who, of course, first of all, had been a strong, staunch imperialist, but was one of the first senior conservatives to become a post-imperialist before the Suez Crisis in 1956. So there was that tension on the right between an imperialist position and a more nation-centric kind of position. Secondly, debates over the Constitution, because some Conservatives would seek to defend the Constitution as inherited wisdom and custom and practice and convention, but sometimes also adopting radical positions on the Constitution, particularly in the 1970s, when there was a fear that Labour was becoming more, much more overtly socialist and introducing all sorts of constitutional measures, perhaps including electoral reform and a written constitution, Bill of Rights, with the aim of trying to constrain the rise of socialism. And thirdly, and I think this is the more relevant one for today, debates over the economy, because in the post-war period, the Conservative right tended to be more national protectionist. And again, with Enoch Powell was a key transitional figure, and certainly since 1979, as I said, the Conservative right very much associated with free market economics. But as I said, the people I looked at very often took an oppositionist position. It was much easier to define they were much easier to define by what they were against rather than what they were for. And very often in almost a kind of knee-jerk, unthinking way, very often they were against the forces of socialism or communism, which they believed at any moment was about to sweep through Britain, the communist menace, the Reds in the bed or under the bed kind of thing. The more thinking, more intelligent figures on the Conservative right realised, I think, that socialism or communism was less the danger, and it was actually liberalism, which was the greater danger to their political project, whether it be the kind of social liberalism, which dominated British politics in the period after 1945, the Keynes and Beveridge tradition that was mentioned before. And thinkers on the Conservative right, like Lord Coleraine, argued that the party was far too willing to concede ground to those and hoped that a more substantive form of conservatism would emerge. Unfortunately, I think for those on the right of the Conservative Party, when that more substantive form of conservatism did emerge, it owed a lot to economic liberalism. And a lot of figures on the Conservative right, and I trace this in the book, were willing to go along with economic liberalism, either because they believed in it or because they believed in the values of economic liberalism. They were essentially classical liberals, or they believed that that kind of economic liberal agenda would restore the kind of core principles of their version of conservatism, which I mentioned before. I mean, for instance, Shirley Letwin argued that Thatcherism wasn't primarily about economics. The means were economic, but the ends, she argued, were moral. And this revival of free market economics had restored what Margaret Thatcher very often called the Victorian values, or I think really she had in mind the values of her father, or what Letwin called the vigorous virtues. Some conservatives were initially, on the right, conservative thinkers were initially rather wary, I think, of Thatcherism. Roger Scruton is a case in point. Wrote The Meaning of Conservatism because he thought that the Thatcherite Conservative Party had bought too much into the ideas of the think tanks like the Institute of Economic Affairs, but did eventually come round to supporting Margaret Thatcher. And other conservatives who personally I feel were more on the ball with this were sustained critics of the kind of free market agenda of Thatcherism, thinking in particular of Peregrine Worsthorne. It was very easy to dismiss Peregrine Worsthorne as a terrible snob, but I think there was some substance to Worsthorne's critique of Thatcherism, that this consistent pursuit of free market economics was actually undermining the conservative values which they held dear, that there was no attempt to reverse the so-called permissive reforms of the 1960s, that really all Thatcherism was doing was creating a selfish, self-interested, new rich class of city financiers and so forth, who were, as Worsthorne put it, just as destructive as football hooligans, whereas football hooligans were destroying football stadiums. Worsthorne argued that the new rich were busily destroying the aspects of traditional Britain to which he subscribed. And even, I think, if you take, for instance, let's take, for instance, Norman Tebbett's famous remark about, my father was unemployed in the 1930s. He didn't riot, he got on his bike and he looked for work. I mean, that could be clearly defended in traditionalist conservative terms, because it's about trying to promote a sense of greater individual responsibility, but also it could be critiqued from a traditionalist conservative point of view, because it very often meant, it meant that people had to, leave their communities, leave their families. Extended families were broken down and so forth, as people moved around to suit the needs of the new emerging economy. So if we look at the contemporary position, this is where sort of there are some things which I think are relevant to a kind of post-liberal politics. I mean, I also have a problem with the term post-liberal, because if liberalism is seen as the meta-ideology, the grand ideology from which everything else post-Enlightenment since the Enlightenment flows, then these other ideologies, including conservatism and socialism, are informed by liberalism. But as I said, I think there are various ways in which conservatives can critique aspects of contemporary liberalism. The first is in relation to Brexit. Apart from a few bores on social media and quite a few, it has to be said, in academia, who want us to reverse the decision and go back into the European Union. That task is largely done. But the dominant position at the moment, amongst, the kind of Britain that people want to create post-Brexit, kind of Singapore on Thames, kind of global Britain, owes again a lot to the kind of ideas of classical free market liberalism, which, as I've argued, I think was detrimental to traditionalist conservative values. So there needs to be the forging of a alternative post-Brexit vision of Britain. I think there needs to be a move away from the kind of dominant focus on consumerism, which has existed in Britain over the last 40 or 50 years, back to a more kind of productionist economic philosophy, a move away from free market economics. And again, there's some ground, I think, for optimism here, perhaps out of necessity rather than choice, but the Conservative Party, I think, is moving in that direction because of the new electoral configuration with the collapse of the Red Wall, the impact of the pandemic. But the Conservatives could go further in that direction. I mean, it goes back to, I think, to some of the points that Chris was making. There were some interesting ideas on the fringes of the Conservative Party in the 70s. They didn't particularly get very far, which goes back to the kind of Catholic social teaching, the ideas of co-partnership, of industrial democracy from a conservative perspective, which could be revived. I think there also needs to be, and again, there's some grounds for optimism here, I think, as well, a move away from a belief in unbridled free trade. And again, some of the Conservative Party have, I think, started to articulate that perspective. Ian Duncan Smith, for instance, I think even John Redwood, who was an arch free marketeer and free trader, has in recent times started to argue about the needs for an element of national protection. I'm not suggesting a kind of siege economy, but there needs to be an element of a recognition of the limits, at least, of free trade and free markets. The fourth thing, I think, is a kind of cautious anti-woke approach. And Conservatives, I think, are sometimes at risk, rather like those Conservatives I mentioned before who feared the imminent communist revolution in Britain, are a danger of sounding rather foolish. But nevertheless, there are grounds, I think, for a kind of cautious anti-woke approach, a recognition of the dangers of what John Gray has called hyper-liberalism. And the fifth area, I think, that contemporary Conservatives need to engage with in a British context is to promote a stronger sense of Englishness, both politically and culturally. I think the Union it's a possibility, isn't it? That post-Brexit, given that Scotland voted in a very different way to the rest of the UK, and given the different kind of economic arrangements in Northern Ireland, that the Union may disintegrate, that the nationalist movements may arise. And Englishness, both politically and culturally, it lags behind the national identities of the other parts of the United Kingdom. So, but they're much less optimistic because the Conservative Party seems unwilling to take on that task of promoting a stronger sense of Englishness, and the Labour Party equally, even more so, because Englishness, I think, on the left is seen as in very pejorative terms. So those 5 areas where I think contemporary Conservatives could engage, and it does mean going back to some of those core values of philosophical conservatism that I mentioned before, and a wariness or scepticism towards things which are liberal, particularly the economic liberal agenda, which I think is very detrimental to traditionalist conservative principles.
Thank you, Kevin. And now we have got the time for discussion. So let me give the floor whoever wants to enter it. Questions and comments. Philip, start it, please.
Just incredibly grateful for those papers, really. It gets us off to a superb start. I'm struck how all of you have outlined, in a way, the 2 liberalisms we have to kind of face and overcome: social liberalism and economic liberalism. But what interests me is, what is the relationship between the two? So I'm of the view that economic liberalism can't happen until social liberalism has happened. So that you first of all have to take apart the society before you can have economic atomism sold to that society. And I think in Britain, helpfully, this is what happened, that we had social liberalism first of the extreme sort in the 1960s. And the attack on nuclear family, the attack on any form of filiation, the rise and celebration of autonomy, the reduction of personhood to sexuality, sexual choice. So in Britain, it's very clear that the attack on liberalism is social, and the 60s succeeded where the Bloomsbury group didn't succeed. And if you think of the denial of objective moral values that's in McIntyre's description of G. Moore's kind of making it ethereal of all objective moral claims. I also think, as Professor Kaufman will outline later, similar movements happened in Canada and elsewhere. And if you look at places like Japan, you have very strong social fabric that prevents, in a number of ways, the type of extreme capitalism. So the question is this, is first of all, what do you think the relationship is between economic and social liberalism? Because it seems clear to me that the material base doesn't lead, that economic liberalism only takes place when social liberalism has done its work. But if that's true, then the only way to correct kind of extreme economic liberalism that we see, for instance, in the P&O ferry kind of just absolute dismissal of workers, is by reviving social conservatism, which in many ways is much harder because the British population is kind of much more ready to hear a critique of economic liberalism, but far less ready to hear social liberalism. So that for me is the question. It's obviously to colleagues in the audience as well. So I'll leave that as the first question, perhaps, for Enz.
Right, thank you. Philip, would anyone like to respond? Because Chris, you mentioned that you don't think there is a contradiction between interventionism and social conservatism. So,
yeah, great question. And I don't pretend to give a complete answer, but I think in the theory of liberalism, at least in the theory of classical liberalism, which is both a skeptical and kind of politics of faith, the connection is freeing the individual from constraint And if you free the individual from constraint, then he will be freer and he'll be better able to realize himself. And that's the case with too much economic constraint, but it's also the case with too many social constraints. So social structures are seen as something artificial and imposed, which prevents people from fully realizing themselves. At the University of Hull, we specialize in the new liberal philosophers of the 1870s up until 1914, really. And that's an interesting turn in the history of liberalism, because I think it goes, it returns to the notion that constraints are actually constitutive of success. And so we see liberals from the 1870s, following T.H. Green chiefly, arguing for that the state should intervene, not only in the way that contracts are made and the kind of constraints being reimposed, but also in changing people's behavior, particularly because working class people in working class districts. So one of Green's interesting essays is about removing the temptation of gin shops on the corners of working class areas, because they need to be guided in the right direction, if you like. What both of those have in common, well, you might think the first one is a politics of skepticism. It's a skepticism about the value of these constraints, whereas then they move to a politics of faith. They believe in the positive belief in those constraints. But I think classical liberalism is actually a bit of a faith as well, because it does presuppose that there's a single good order and that we can perfect ourselves by achieving this order. So I think that the question of how economic liberalism and social liberalism are connected depends what kind of liberalism you mean. Do you mean classical liberalism, or do you mean new liberalism? And do you mean each of those in their more skeptical mode, which is about the limits of government power, the limits of individual politicians, the limits of our knowledge about what the good life is. So each of those has a skeptical mode and I think a faith mode. And so the connections in political theory are different for each of those four variants, if you like. I haven't answered your question. If anything, I've just made it more complicated.
Yeah, thanks. So if I look at my conservatives, this is when you know that you've spent too much time looking in the archives and obscure pamphlets from the 1940s. But if I look at my individualists, as they called themselves back in the Second World War, they would be absolutely horrified by what we're calling economic liberalism. If Britain is economically liberal, they would want to have nothing to do with it. Because if you look at if you look at my kind of my sector of kind of life, universities is a perfect example of neoliberalism in the way in which it's using the power of the state in order to construct a market that was not there beforehand. It takes an enormous amount of bureaucracy and form filling and people in universities in order to create league tables and star charts to allow people to make market-based choices on which university they'd like to go to. So I would probably want to suggest that actually we need to think about in relation with Chris, like differences between different types of liberalism, particularly a kind of classical liberalism and a more neoliberalism, and a classical liberalism that didn't have a neoliberalism that didn't have its origins in the Second World War, came much later. I'd also kind of want to emphasize the difference between social and economic liberalism in terms of economic liberalisms of the neoliberal variety as a way in which to maintain order and discipline, a disciplinary function that the market, because there was not the power of deference to the same extent. There was not the power of traditional elites within communities. People like Enoch Powell were worried about the fabric of society breaking apart. And economic liberalism and the market provided a possible route for a return to discipline and a return to authority in British society. So that I would say economic liberalism in that case was presented as a solution to social liberalism. And on your final point about kind of which is the easier nut to crack, essentially, I think both of them are exceptionally difficult. And while there might be an electoral base that's interested in rolling back free market reforms, we have to be careful about whether there is a significant political base within the Conservative Party and within the wider kind of funding world that supports it that would be interested in that too. So both very difficult.
Yeah, I think the pattern that you outlined, Philip, is accurate. So the social liberalism of the 1960s, followed by the economic liberalism, and now followed by a new wave of social liberalism as well. And of course, liberals, advocates of all
Kevin,
of those.
can you lean a little bit? Yeah.
Advocates of all of those types of liberalism would stress that they're wanting to extend individual freedom and choice. There's two ways, I think, of responding to that. One is a kind of more reactionary position, which is to try to reverse the changes which have occurred. A wiser strategy might be to point out that, well, that liberalism can be an authoritarian and actually illiberal, intolerant doctrine, that anyone who opposes it is denounced and has to be defeated to impose the kind of liberal worldview. The other is to point out that change, of course, does not necessarily equate to progress, and that some of the changes which have occurred over that period of time that you're talking about have created new social problems which need to be addressed, and that therefore scepticism of this kind of, if there is a grand liberal project, is legitimate and should be aired.
Yes, David and then John.
Thank you. I really enjoyed those talks. I've got a question for each paper. So, Chris, I was really struck by your fake versus real institution concept there. And I think one prime example, like many issues in modern society, can be traced back to the Local Government Act 1972, where a series of small local councils that had in some cases existed for hundreds of years were just swept aside and replaced with largely artificial constructions. I say to my students all the time, Knowsley isn't a real place. There's nobody who at the time would have said, I'm from Knowsley, but it was created because it met a certain population threshold. And in Merseyside, that saw the reduction of the number of local councils from about 23 to 5. No sense of identity or place. So I wouldn't, and this kind of chimes in with what you said earlier, John, about you can't ignore the laws of economics, but you can say, actually, we're going to value something else more than that. And if bigger councils are more efficient, so smaller councils cost more, but that might be a price worth paying. And in the government's current reforms, it seems that bigger is better, and this doesn't seem to end. So I wonder what your thoughts would be. What your thoughts would be about the role of maybe local government and reform. For Kit, where are the modern day equivalents of these organisations, party-sponsored policy formation groups? And what does it mean that maybe this role has been contracted out to think tanks reliant on private funding? What might that mean for the type of policy that we get? And finally, Kevin, I thought that final point about English identity was really interesting, because English identity, Scottish identity and Welsh identity all correlate with different value structures. So English identity is correlates with right-wing values, populist values and more authoritarian values, whereas Welsh identity correlates with left-wing economic values and authoritarian values, and then Scottishness correlates with left-wing and populist. So how can you create a post-liberal politics or a right-wing conservative politics that speaks to all of these different identity groups when the power of Britishness as a unifying identity seems to be fading away?
Right, so a number of questions. let's start with Chris Vanas.
Yeah, and I'll try to answer it quite quickly. I think that's one of the institutions that people do care about is local government. And they would like, and people who specialise in local government and participate in it, such as Dan, much more than me, will know the difference between real local government and fake local government, I think, much better than I do. But I would make a case for restoring real local government. But here is the catch, and this is my sceptical moment. I don't think people vote for that in general elections. I don't think it's a vote winner. And I think we also face the problem that we face with other local institutions and the civic middle, if you like, broadly conceived, which is the basic and perhaps obvious problem or even contradiction of attempting to use the blunt instrument of central government to refill a hollowed out civil society of autonomous civic organisation. What you can classically get is just new agencies, new targets, new central controls and new areas of dependency. So exactly how to do that would be somebody else's job to suggest, I think, rather than mine. I mean, if I were to pronounce on that, I would be out of my comfort zone. But I do think it's something that people care about when it comes particularly to local elections and local issues. And there is frustration about local government in all sorts of parts of the country.
Yes, Kate.
That's a really interesting question, David. Thanks. What does it mean when these kind of bodies get contracted out? So I should probably start by saying there were plenty of essentially contracted out think tanks and cabals and groupings that existed during the time. I think one of, in this kind of wider conservative movement that I talk about, one of the really fascinating things, though, and I'm not, don't want to get too Marxist in this, but you did have a situation in Britain in the 1940s, 50s and 60s and earlier, where there were really quite distinct different types of economic interests within British capital. So you had people in the kind of shipping and insurance business who were your classical liberals. You had very imperial-orientated exporters, and you had kind of more light manufacturers who were interested in domestic consumption, in successful businesses rather than businesses that weren't doing so well and were thinking, therefore, about kind of state support. So in some ways, the external organizations, because they relied on funding from outside, often from business, but from a British capitalist class that was very different and perhaps more varied than it is today, actually led to generating very different types of policy proposals that came out of it. There's also you mentioned that kind of really fascinating thing about kind of what happens on the inside. So we have a really nice example from the Second World War in this post-war problems central committee, PWPCA, as no one until now has ever called it, is that centrally organized institutions often feel a need to be representative. So when Butler was just in charge of the CCMP, he could push it in his own direction. When he was put as kind of the leader of the PWPCC, what he had to do was to bring in different ideas and interests and groupings within the party. And what that created was policy that kind of was met the lowest common denominator of agreement. So that's one of the reasons why the Conservative Party manifesto in 1945, which is very much centred around Churchill, is relatively bland. It wasn't because there was an absence of ideas in the party, quite the opposite. There were too many of them, and they were too different that the party ended up just going with the limits of what it could agree on. So there's advantages to both.
Danger of intellectuals. Kevin, your point.
Okay. Well, just to come back to the question about the councils, local councils and so on, the question that was asked to Chris. I mean, those 72 reforms, and more recently, further local government reforms, the creation of unitary authorities in some areas, there's no buy-in from local people. People feel an emotional attachment to their village, their town, their historic county, but not to the very often to these artificially created state counties. Yeah. So I mean, where I am where I live in Cheshire in England, people feel a loyalty to their local town or to Cheshire as a historic county, and the county council and all of the borough councils were abolished and replaced with two unitary authorities, Cheshire East, Cheshire West, and I suspect that most people don't know which one they're actually in, and there's no loyalty to those councils. In terms of the thing about English values, I know it's not quite the question that you asked, David, but it's the one I'm going to answer, which is that there are different conceptions, aren't there, in each of those constituent parts of the United Kingdom over what that particular national identity means. So you said about the conservatism of England. Of course, there is an English conservative tradition, but there's also an English radical leftist tradition. And the Labour Party is very frightened to go anywhere near that, and has been for quite some time, I think, not just under Jeremy Corbyn, but also under New Labour, which is also very anti-English, in my view. And you saw that, say, for instance, in the 2010 general election, when Gordon Brown had that prearranged, seemingly random, but prearranged discussion with that Labour member, Gillian Duffy, and he gets in the car and the microphone is still on, and he refers to this bigoted woman. Who put me in front of this bigoted woman? And the questions, actually, most of the discussion, if you watch it, was not about immigration at all. The comments she made about immigration were perfectly reasonable. So New Labour is as bad, I think, in this regard as Corbynite Labour, despite all the other differences between them, in this kind of very strong sense of anti-Englishness. But there is you're right, there's a conservative English tradition, but there's also an English radical tradition. So, and again, in Scotland and in Wales, no doubt there are also different traditions which can be tapped into, different parts of each of those nations' histories, which might suit a more conservative argument or a more radical position.
But Kevin, I think that the point can be, or the question can be rephrased in the way whether English conservatives should search for Scottish conservatives, Wales conservatives, and try to negotiate with them a common ground, or go back to British conservatism and that's it. To be more universal and, as Philip would like it, and less nationalist. And from a point of view, certainly of a Scottish conservative, of course, it makes sense to be unionist. But the point I was making before was not necessarily that English separatists or English nationalists will willingly create an independent England, but an independent England might happen by default. Great. So, John, and who else will? Yes.
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed the three talks. They were fantastically interesting. My sympathies as a barely reconstructed Thatcherite, rather more with Professor Fear, but because I would argue myself that Mrs. Thatcher's, the classical liberalism in Mrs. Thatcher's record, being, in a sense, the predominant one, is explained very largely by the nature of the challenges she faced politically on coming into power. They were economic challenges, and she had to really, if you want to revive Britain, you had to deal with the economy first. But my question, I have two quick questions. One is to Professor Cole, which is this. What happened afterwards to R.A. Butler? Because it's my impression that his tendency of thought in the Tory party reached its apogee in the Industrial Charter, which I think was about 1949, which then seemed to have almost no effect on the Churchill government, when it came in, and really that was much more of a classical liberal drift in British politics until Macmillan got into power and then got a 100 majority, in which case he reverted to his childhood and imposed a kind of more interventionist one. So how did that happen, really? And secondly, do all of you think Cameronism, if there is such a thing, fits into your ideological perspectives?
Right, Chris, you wanted to respond, or?
Yes, I will. And I think you're right about Thatcherism or Margaret Thatcher's policies individually being largely an effect of the challenges that she faced. And I think that's one of the best points that Oakeshott makes in the politics of faith and the politics of skepticism, is that because these are ideal extremes, in practice, the style of governing will shift between those two. And sometimes there will need to be more skepticism, and sometimes there will need to be more faith. He advocates a kind of attitude of a trimmer, drawing explicitly on Halifax, and he thinks in our time, and he's writing in the 1950s, there's rather too much faith and we need more trimmers to pull it back towards skepticism. If you take the view that Thatcherism is a kind of skepticism, I don't make that claim because I think there are elements of faith to it as well. I think it's mixed. One might say that part of Cameronism was an attempt to shift it back towards a kind of faith, but an egalitarian faith, which is why you get not only the sort of economic skepticism of austerity, but also gay marriage. So I think those are sort of the two, Cameronism, austerity and gay marriage, right? maybe that's the summary. I think that's all I'll say for now.
Yes, good.
What happened to Butler and the Industrial Charter is a great question. In many ways, the Industrial Charter, it's this document, if you don't know about it, it's this document that's produced, I think, 1947, 48. Butler's in charge of making it. It's designed to show that essentially the welfare state and the post-war settlement, as it's called, is safe in the Conservative Party's hands. In many ways, it's often presented as a radical break from what came before, but in reality, it's just a continuation of interwar Baldwinite conservatism that would not have looked out of place in 1935. But it looked out of place to Churchill. When Churchill saw the Industrial Charter, he famously said, "Oh, my goodness, look at what Labour have come up with. We've got them on the ropes now." As well as being someone who was, he was temperamentally a liberal of the early 20th century, and he was interested in free trade, but he was mainly also a conservative of the Cold War. And the most important thing in that period, when tensions in Korea had only still there, was to ensure that the country was stable enough in order to fight another world war if such a thing would occur. Hence, what was broadly seen as the appeasement of the trade union movement. So I think the Industrial Charter was not as radical as it was made out, and it was all action of the Conservative Party in that period. And indeed, I think we tend to, particularly when we're talking about political ideas, box political ideas off into the kind of domestic category and not recognize that conservatives in office or out of office are always concerned about questions of foreign policy, and will often have foreign policy lead to domestic policy and not the other way around. Where does Cameron fit in all of this? It's a fascinating question because he's a kind of fascinating character. If we mentioned earlier about Mrs. Thatcher attempting to recreate the England of her father, the England that she grew up in the 1930s. I think there's a case to be made that Cameron was attempting to do for England what had to create for the rest of the country the Oxfordshire village in which he lived. A socially, which I happen to know very well, a largely classless, because it's all really people of the same middle class bracket who live in Chadlington, society of liberal, tolerant people who do not need large amounts of welfare because they have considerable amounts of money already, and where there is, perhaps as a result of that, a very strong set of kind of civic reciprocity of local shops, looking out for the neighbours, etc. And I think that was his idealised image of England that he wanted to create. But in some ways, it was only possible in somewhere like Charlbury because of who and where it was.
Right, Kevin, you wanted to comment on Cameronism?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to discuss with you, John, about Thatcherism at some point, your views on Thatcherism, because, I think we would disagree, because I don't think there was anything inevitable about the collapse of the Keynesian welfare state or inevitable about the triumph of Thatcherism. I don't think, despite her often repeated acronym TINA, that was the only alternative, and there are other models which could have been followed at that stage. In terms of Cameronism, once the major government falls in '97, obviously there's a debate about how the Conservative Party revives itself, revives itself ideologically. So there are some who argue that that sort of mix of economic liberalism and social conservatism that was present within Thatcherism should continue. There are others like Philip who argued for a more kind of localist civil society kind of model. And there was also that debate between the so-called mods and the rockers around 2000. The mods arguing that essentially, as I understood it, that the economic liberalism should continue, but it should be combined with social liberalism, which essentially is what I would see as the kind of Cameron ideological position. Liberalism writ large, really, across the board, as my friend Matt Beach has written in a very good chapter, which influenced my thinking on this, about Cameron as a liberal in across the board, really.
Right, thank you. Danny, and then the gentleman.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you so much. I mean, those talks are so interesting and helpful. I really appreciate it. Philip, I think, framed our mission really well at the outset, which is that we need to come up with an alternative universalism, in contrast to the hegemonic liberal universalism, but not retreating into a narrow parochial or nationalist kind of particularism. So that's our mission. I think to answer it, it's been very helpful, because what we're really about is what is the purpose of society and its agent, the state. What's the purpose? Where are we aiming? And I think unless we are complete nihilists, we need to recognise that it is valid to imagine that there is a purpose to society, a kind of common endeavour, which is why I think Chris's point about Oakeshott is right, and I think we should come down on the side of the enterprise state. So what is the enterprise? What's the common mission? And I want, Chris, if you could unpack it a bit more, what you actually think that is, because I'm afraid I don't think I've really heard it. But because we're so concerned not to be utopians who have our own vision of the New Jerusalem, a kind of ideal state that we're trying to create. So what is our mission? I wonder if it, just as a challenge to you, whether it, as conservatives, what that mission is it's the production of good people. And how do we do that? What is our political activity? It's to cultivate the conditions of virtue. It's to create the circumstances in which good people will arise, which doesn't predicate an outcome, but it does, as it were, frame the order that we should be trying to build. And whether that's adequate as a political purpose and mission, or whether we need to be a bit more specific about what we're trying to create.
Thank you, Danny. Chris, take care that you now advise politics. So let's see how it goes with the help, of course, of...
So I think that's exactly the right question, Danny. If there is a politics of faith, and that's what... If there is a Tory politics of faith, and that at a time when the electorate is demanding more faith and less scepticism, so less of a view of the purpose of the state simply to reduce or lessen the severity of conflict. Your question, what is the purpose of society, implies already in its question the faith view, because government is for something positive, if you like, rather than just the maintenance of that. So what is that? I think specifically the Conservatives have to focus on those institutions, those parts of the authentic historic continuity, continuous institutional order that are in need of restoration, where that restoration is something that government can realistically achieve, where the institutions are anyway within the historical remit of the sovereign authority, and where the benefit to working class voters would be something tangible and something that they can't miss. I think it's helpful first to identify a certain job done, which is the UK's restored institution of national borders. And I think the Conservatives should milk that for all it's worth, because leaving the EU has restored sovereignty over immigration rules, which means that foreign powers can no longer be blamed for cheap labour undercutting the wages of the native working class. So long as the rules of entry, settlement, citizenship, and especially employment are competently managed, since immigration policy is essentially labour policy, this should make life harder for the kind of populist, if you like, charlatan statesmen who have in recent years been able to make electoral hostages of natural Conservative voters. So what are these concrete institutions? Well, among the other institutions that foster the kind of liberties and the kind of restraint required for living well, and I think here a new liberal notion of self-realisation of the individual, which won't necessarily be the same for all individuals. I think that natural diversity between individuals is an important thing to retain. But these have to be things which are genuinely desired by red wall voters. So I think among those institutions, we find ownership of a house within a proper neighbourhood, which means restoring the property market and the construction industry, both of which have been corrupted by vested interests and sectoral oligarchs. And I think being pro-free market means being anti-oligarch. It means especially anti-middleman oligarch, and seeking to extend genuine participation of the working class in a properly restored market. Entrepreneurship and young hipster startups, those will inevitably produce Conservative voters anyway, in like Twickenham and Bath and places like that. Both Philip Blond and Michael Lind advocate involving employees in decision-making in the workplace, albeit in slightly different ways. I would add to what they've said that meritocracy in the workplace is badly in need of restoration. Nothing as ambitious as recruitment and promotion based on virtue, as Philip advocates. Presently, I would just settle for competence. I think the Conservatives should be targeting working class people who believe that they would benefit from better meritocracy in their locale. And by locale, I mean the institutions in which they're already working. Too often, our civic institutions, take universities, for example, are governed by fake managers who have failed upwards and thus become members of a conspicuously incompetent but unaccountable and quasi-hereditary managerial class, which defends its position chiefly by closing rank, by hiring only from within its own managerial jargon cult, albeit disguised with noisy programs of sanctimonious race and sex-based favoritism, and sustaining a permanent revolution while shirking responsibility to fake committees, fake consultants, and fake training. The unaccountability of fake management, I think, will be broken by workplace power sharing, percolating responsibility downwards, if you like, within institutions that already exist, that are already working in some way, albeit slightly dysfunctionally because of the management, making those at the top of the hierarchy more accountable, and this sustains meritocratic conditions. It also percolates, in doing that, the experience of genuine autonomous organisation and leadership, which is lacking in the sector of non-profit civic associations. You need to create people who have experience of doing that, otherwise they're not going to set up and run things voluntarily, because they don't have not only the time and the money to give, but they don't have the experience to give. So I don't think that allowing responsibility to percolate downwards needs to be costly or legislatively demanding. It basically means removing the main incentives that have arisen in recent years for managers to impose excessive regulations upon their subordinates, thus mitigating the risks associated with more autonomous employees. I think, I would also suggest, finally, I know this is a long answer and I apologize for that. I also think that workplace boards, committees or councils that are reformed in this way would do a better job of setting up substantive benefits, as in substantive benefits, not just payouts, for employees, including affordable childcare and protected free time. I think if you have employees on the boards who are able to vote for creches in the workplace that provide affordable childcare, then I think that's a pro-family and inexpensive policy, because it places the burden on the business. I would only add to that members of the managerial class already get these in-work benefits, including dental care in some cases, right? While the rest of us have to pay for a filling. If you want, more ambitious cosmetic treatment to sex change is free on the NHS, of course. But so I think those substantive benefits already exist. They just need to be percolated downwards with responsibility and more accountability in the workplace, in those institutions.
Great. Gentlemen.
Köszönöm szépen, thank you. And thank you to the Danube Institute and the University of Public Service for putting on today's event. My name is Dénes András Nagy. I'd like to ask 2 questions to all of our panelists. Could you please name one thing that British Conservatives could learn from Hungarian Conservatives, and conversely, one thing that Hungarian Conservatives could learn from British Conservatives? Thank you.
Wow. What a task.
I'm not going to give advice to Hungarians. I'm going to invite someone else to do that. But I will give advice to British Conservatives. And whether it's learning about Hungary, or whether it's Poland or any other part of the world, the Conservative Party used to be a much more internationalist political party. You read debates from I don't mean internationalists in kind of a normative kind of way. You read debates in the 1940s, and you have equivalents of The Spectator doing long, in-depth articles about the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You have considerably informed discussion about the politics of the Swiss cantons. I think the best thing that British Conservatives could learn from Hungarian Conservatives is probably to be less interested in America and more interested in other places. So.
Thanks, Kit. Kevin, would you like to take the challenge?
It's a great question, Dénes. I don't know enough about Hungarian conservatism to start making any broad claims about it. But one thing that strikes me is the notion that the fundamental unit of society is the family rather than the individual. And that means that rather than giving families the difficult task of surviving in an order which is created for individuals who have renounced their constraints, we ask individuals who have renounced their constraints to live within an order based upon the family. That's one possible thing. Now, the difficulty in Western Europe and in the UK is the sensitive issue of the family, because it's been reduced to a lifestyle choice that not everybody has equal access to, and we therefore have to be mindful and essentially remove the preference for anything that not everybody can do or not everybody can create. I think that undermines all institutions, not only the family.
If I can misuse my position, talking about these relationships between the British Conservatives and other parts of the world, what would be the lessons of the Brexit for countries in this region? Is there something that might be taken as a conclusion or a lesson or a cautionary remark or whatever?
Unfortunately, it's a lesson that's too late to be learned. But the lesson in the other direction, and Hungary provides it to British Conservatives, is that you could have your own distinct national economy and set of social policies within the European Union, as much as you may push up against limits. Those things did exist. And the great problem was that there was not to relitigate an argument, that there was not a nationalist case for being part of the European Union.
So you think there was a chance for a conservative position within the European Union?
Yeah, so...
If Merkel had agreed to Cameron on migration limitation, we'd be in a different world.
I think the problems that the EU has with your great and beautiful country and the problems that it had with our great and beautiful country are different problems. If there's a single lesson that unites the two, it's that the European project, under the name of ever closer union, means ever more concentration of power in the European institutions, and attempting to reclaim that power, believing that the European institutions will relinquish power back to the nation state is fictional. They don't do that. You have to take it by force. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I think that's a lesson about how the EU works, which we've learned from the Brexit process, before which I think we were a lot more optimistic about the possible repatriation of powers within the European Union. They won't do it. It doesn't work.
Great. Final question. Yes, Philip. You started, you finished.
Oh, sorry. I was just struck by Danny's remarks and also by the remarks about David Cameron when I came in. I was very much involved in the creation of the big society, the thesis of broken Britain, all of it. I wrote most of it. Looking back, the mistake I made was that I was too anti-state. And I think now, if I recapitulated, I would think much more of a participative state. Because if we want to empower civil society, we can't do it by state withdrawal. And I think that would be a critique of my earlier position. And so what we have to do, just to go to Danny's question and how we reverse it, is what I think was right in what we were doing is we were starting to talk about the freedom of groups rather than the freedom of individuals. And when you talk about the freedom of groups, you actually talk about replacing individualism with shared obligations and shared contracts. And I think that's the way back against social liberalism, is by showing, for instance, the pregnancy penalty for women. So the huge drive of social liberalism has been to liberate women from families, from relationships, from children. And women don't think that's a liberation, actually. They think it's increasingly come with cost. So if you could recapitulate the family around women's rights so they don't suffer the pregnancy penalty, you start making social conservatism not a pejorative, but genuinely progressive and attractive. And you start reinscribing shared collective obligations, which is what I think we as conservatives should do. But I think this kind of takes us to Danny's question. I don't think it's wrong to want to produce good people, but good people for what? You know, what's the content of that? And I think that we form the part of the content through our associative behaviour, because we know what's good for children broadly. We know what they need, stability. You know, we know the needs of human beings much more clearly than postmodernism will allow. But there's another interesting good which we are going to explore, which is the good of the all beyond the nation. And that's kind of part of what I think is really implied by the language of morality. And what we what we shouldn't avoid, and this is why I was so struck by Chris's point, is morality. I've been reading lots of anthropological stuff about the use of morality. Morality is a guide through complexity. And whole societies, the Roman Empire was governed by morality, right? It wasn't governed by the iron laws of economics. It was governed by honor. And it was governed by content of honor. And actually, if you look at Roman local government, as oddly I have done, it was actually governed by honor and how you, and your role and what you had to do in fulfilling that honor in respect of your commune or how you distribute it. So kind of one part of how we might link Danny's point about the good is linking to these associative, the good for whom, the good for which locality, the good for which group. That might be a way to build our bridges back. Just a thought.
Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a very interesting comment, because my criticism of the kind of red Tory and blue Labour thesis when it first emerged was precisely the kind of anti-statist position that came out there, because there needs to be a countervailing power if we're going to move away from the kind of economic liberal paradigm. And civil society by itself can't do that. It does need to be done through the state. But of course it needs to be the state underpinned by the right values, because it was still the state that was driving the economic liberal agenda with those values. So yeah, I welcome the comment that you just made. I agree. The state is profoundly important.
The problem for the big society project is the same problem that John O'Sullivan pointed out earlier on, which is the precise nature of the challenge that was being faced in 2010, and that is reducing the government's budget deficit. And I think it's a great idea if you have the money. If there isn't any money left, then of course you're asking people to initiate things for themselves when they don't have any more time, any more money, or any more experience than they used to have. But I don't think that was it. You shouldn't blame yourself for not having recognised the role of the state. The problem was the lack of money. I think if there had been money available, then it's a different question.
Is that George Osborne's austerity agenda went out over Cameron's big society agenda.
Yeah.
And the austerity, I think a case can be made for maybe 6 months of securing public debt, but afterwards it's an entirely political decision at enormous cost, and there's no necessity in it. And the tragedy for me, as someone who's directly advising Cameron, is how easily and simply he just let Osborne capture it all. And it's still a mystery to me why he let his own project be eroded completely by a mindless austerity-driven approach.
Sorry, go on.
Do you think he was ever sincere?
I'm naive in the fact that I think all people are sincere. I regularly meet people and believe them. It's an ongoing personal issue, no doubt. I just here's a nice way of responding. I don't think he believed in it enough. Politics is about choices, and whenever he chose, he didn't choose the big society. It became a fake, kind of vestigial project that died on the line.
Yeah.
On your second point, very briefly about governing with honour, there's Ferenc won't abuse his position to tell you this, but there's a great section in his book about the prudent individual's resources, including the virtues of civility, of trimming, of the kind of virtues needed for maintaining the nomos, the institutional order, including its practices, its own virtues, and that's essentially it. So I would recommend reading it. I can't possibly summarize it now.
A useful end, but a kid, yes.
I'll try and be brief with my answer to what is the good that we're aiming towards. Usually a topic that you can deal with in about a couple of minutes, but so
2 minutes.
2 minutes. All right, 7:07. So I think one of the things that we have to reckon with is the fact that perpetuation is a necessary end in itself. And maybe it's because I spend too much time in the Second World War. Maybe I watch too much news of what's going on across the border from here. But that perpetuation should not be taken for granted as something that inevitably happens without good action. Whether that's the threat of changing balances of power, whether it's the threat of climate change. These are things that have to be thought about when we're trying to aim for a good life. You have to have a life to start with. And that life and the life of society should not be taken for granted when you're trying to come up with your ends.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone. Especially the speakers, but also the audience. And what we are going to have now is a lunch break. So everyone is welcome to have some fine food in Hungary. That's important for us, and even more important for conservatives. So let's enjoy that. And we will convene at 2 o'clock for the next session, British Conservatism, Living or Dead Traditions. So you can consider your answer to this question, which will be discussed in the next session. Thank you very much.